Hi, everybody. Welcome to our event today, Principles of Speaking Plainly. This seminar adapts principles of plain language to the context of speaking, covering not only wording, but also structure and integration with visual aids. This event is hosted by DigitalGov University, and I'm going to turn it over to our hosts today, Catherine Spivey and Chip Crane.
Thank you so much. This is Catherine Spivey. I'm co-chair of the Plain Language Action and Information Network, and I'm delighted to have Christopher Chip Crane here today to talk about the principles of speaking plainly. Chip is a writing and public speaking trainer and communication consultant, providing writing workshops and one-on-one coaching, and he writes and revises documents for clients. He serves on the executive board for the Center for Plain Language, a nonprofit that promotes clear writing in government and industry. And I know Chip from when he led the Center's Federal Report Card project from 2015 to 2017. And he now oversees that report and other reports and publications for the Center. He, as a senior project manager for ARL Inc., he has worked since 2011 on contract for the Department of Homeland Security, giving workshops on topics such as plain language, writing for impact, effective email, performance goals, and responding to Congress. He operates independently as the CEO of C-Point Consulting. Clients include the National Institutes of Health, the Department of Labor, the FDIC, and the Institute of International Finance. Chip is also a senior lecturer at the University of Maryland at College Park, where he teaches writing for the health professions, technical writing, and literature. From 1999 to 2010, he taught writing and literature at the U.S. Naval Academy in Annapolis, also directing the Academy's Writing Center for 8 years. And as a writing consultant, he aims to strengthen writers themselves, not just their writing. He holds a PhD in English from the Catholic University of America, an MA in Teaching, Writing, and Literature from George Mason University, and a BS in English from the Naval Academy. He lives in Annapolis, Maryland with his wife, 4 children, and many books. So thank you so much. We're looking forward to your presentation very much.
Thanks so much for having me, Catherine. And it's always a pleasure to collaborate with the Plain Group, here on behalf of the Center. And we really appreciate the work you all do to promote clear federal writing, as I'm sure many do. So I want to talk, as Alex shared in the intro, talk about public speaking and giving presentations. The sort of setting that I have in mind here is the frequent short, 5-minute brief. Maybe it's around the table with your branch. Maybe it's more of a high-stress situation in front of a senior person in your office. It could be a number of settings. The principles would apply to longer presentations as well, of course, but I think the common, have to throw a few things together, maybe put some slides together, don't have a lot of time. We don't often take the time it really needs to prepare a talk that would be considered plain. Of course, if you say, I heard a really plain talk today, it doesn't sound very exciting, right? Mm-hmm. But the idea, just as with plain writing or plain language, the idea would be a clear, audience-friendly, engaging talk. It doesn't have to be bouncing off the walls. It doesn't have to be TED Talk level, necessarily, but just some principles for preparing what you're going to say, as well as some principles of an actual delivery I'll go into at the end. A little bit of public speaking 101 here, so some of these things I'm sure will be familiar. So I'll start by talking about crafting your content, meaning what are you going to say in this talk that you're going to give, again, whether it's short or long. You really want to think about 3 vital factors, and then this is kind of a summary slide. I'll talk about finding the heart of your talk, and then organizing that strategically, that message. And then I'll talk a little bit about choosing and using an appropriate style and tone, which is analogous to the sentences we would put into a document. And then after that, I'll move into delivered presentation, a little bit about presentation and delivery. So these three vital factors are audience, purpose, and context. Just as with a document, you're sending an email or writing a new policy or putting some information up on a website, you have to think about whom you're writing for and what you're hoping to accomplish. The same thing with a talk. We often take it for granted. Well, I've got to give this talk. I've got to update the group. I have to prepare, read ahead and then go to this meeting and talk to the undersecretary or the division director or whatever it might be. Sometimes we take the occasion of the talk that, makes us have to go do it. And often we're not. Many people are not excited about having to give a presentation. It's not everyone's favorite thing. People say that, fear of speaking is right up there with the fear of death for a lot of people, surveys show. And that's a factor in, most people that I've talked with don't love writing stuff either, but it doesn't carry quite that fear factor. So, add all those things that for a lot of people that they don't care for about having to write something important, and then add to that potentially the anxiety and the real time. We're right here in the room right now, and if I make a mistake, it really stands out. Those kinds of fears. It's understandable that people don't always give the quality of a presentation that they probably are capable of. Mm-hmm. I think we've probably all heard talks, whether it was at work or at a banquet or church or somewhere that was a little hard to follow or a little cumbersome or something like that. So think about, your audience. Whom are you reaching? If just as with a piece of writing, if you're briefing the people on your team, that you can use vocabulary that you all use all the time, and people are going to follow that. You can be a little more jumbled perhaps, and people won't lose you. They may be less engaged. And if you start defining lots of terms for people who already know those things, they might even feel a little condescended or something. So, but then if you're speaking to a group that includes outsiders, it might still be at work, might be from the next branch over or the next division. They might not talk in the same categories that you do. They might not be conscious of the same problems that your group is always dealing with and solving. And it's not just about technical vocabulary, it's sometimes about, again, categories of thought or principles. So you really, it doesn't take a lot of time, but you want to think through, well, what's the perspective of the people that I'm speaking to? And it's not only what do they know and what do I need to teach them, it's also what do they care about, right? What are they interested in? And that's maybe even more important than getting the sort of technical language right, because that you can lose them. They can feel bored if you start in on what you think is most important and you start listing lots of things and going into detailed, explanations of things that haven't engaged their attention, especially when they're just listening, even if you have slides or something. So you really want to think about what do they care about, what's going to matter to them, what's going to engage them from the start. And this is all in the planning stages as you're putting your outline together or your notes or your slides. Very closely related, of course, is the purpose. What do you want your audience to do as a result of hearing your talk? Now, it may not be a speech where you're trying to get them to go out and vote for something or do something, give money, like really concrete, but there's some purpose. If there's no purpose to your talk, then you shouldn't be giving it. Now, you might not be told the purpose. Somebody might say, yeah, I need you to brief the group on Friday about the status of your work. And, that's kind of tough because you don't necessarily know why you're supposed to brief the group. You could ask respectfully, not, why do I have to do that? But you can own this. What do you want them to do? You have a lot of potential to influence. And when you really start to think about how do I engage these folks? And some of them you might know, and some of them you might not know. And if they're higher ups, that might make you nervous. I know that. But also as you think about, well, what do I really want them to do? That can actually make the speech a little more fun or seem more exciting to you, actually, if you're not already excited. Now, if it's your idea and we got to talk about this, maybe that purpose is already right on the tip of your brain. But quite often, we assume as speakers and presenters, we assume that the topic of our talk is sort of comes with a self-explanatory purpose. But the topic and the purpose are different. Topic is more general. I'm going to speak about plain language, but that's very broad. And you want to think about, again, what do you want them to do? And then context is a little harder to pin down, but it has to do with the problem that brings them to the talk in the first place. Maybe they're just there because you all have a weekly meeting and everybody goes around and does a 5-minute update. That's part of context, and that means that you've got a sort of a built-in reason because you're just updating. But what do you want them to take away from this? Sometimes the context is also the actual room. Are you going to have people in the room? Is it going to be totally webinar like this presentation here? It may not drastically change what you say and how you say it, but it might change a few things, and it might change what you include, and what also background circumstances are going on in your building or your office. Is it budget time and everybody's really just worried about getting their budget requests in, and you're trying to talk about something completely different? Well, that might not change the heart of the main content, but you might want to acknowledge, put in there, I know everybody's thinking about budgets, but I want you to understand one piece that's actually going to contribute to how you think about your budget. That will get their attention more than if you just sort of ignore the budget context, or maybe it's the end of September and everybody's working on end of year appraisals, and you're trying to talk about money, which is also a big thing at the end of the year, of course.
So if I can interrupt
yes.
just for a second, Chip. So what you're saying is connect the dots for your audience. Do not leave them to make the connection.
That's right. Yeah, I think that's a good way to put it. And especially at the beginning, to first get their attention, to help them to see why it matters to them and think about what's going to matter. Sometimes we talk about having a little hook or something. It doesn't have to be like super witty or snazzy. I mean, if you have something in mind, that's great. But just help make it explicit why you're giving this talk and what you want them to do with it. And sometimes that is a little more built in and obvious than others, but don't take it for granted, that the dots are connected. And you can reinforce that as you go along as well. And probably the most important step in this process, and this is still in the preparation, okay, as you're thinking through it, and that is what I'm going to call here finding the heart of your presentation. In a document, we might say, what's the bottom line, or what's the main idea first. First, before you can put your bottom line up front, you have to figure out what it is, or what is the heart of your talk. What's the one thing you really want people to walk away with? And that can be harder to pin down than it might sound, even for the speaker. But imagine if you're not sure what the heart of the presentation is, how likely are the listeners going to be to take that away? So, and it's very time, place, audience, and purpose dependent. As you change to a different audience, the heart of your talk might be slightly different. You give the same talk to higher up leaders versus peers versus subordinates. The center of gravity may just shift a little. Time and place, it might shift a little bit. Maybe not drastically, but it's very context dependent. So to get at that heart of your talk, or as it says here at the top, your bottom line, one thing that you can ask yourself is, if you only had 20 seconds, if your 5-minute slot at the meeting gets shrunk to 30 seconds because we ran out of time, because somebody else went too long, or there were a lot of questions, what one thing would you say? Hey, Chip, sorry, we'll have to catch you next week, but real quick, what did you want to say? Well, if I've got that prepared, I can say it, but hopefully that won't happen. But this is a kind of a test to figure out what would that bottom line statement be. And it's good to have a sentence, maybe even written out, even if you don't write out the whole talk, that you state explicitly. Another way to kind of find that elusive bottom line is to think, as you look at your notes or your outline or whatever it is you're preparing with, is there one thing that everything else kind of supports or hovers around? You might do an outlining process where you, just like a school paper, you have a thesis statement and 3 supporting points, and it might be really straightforward. But again, when we're so close to the material and we're preparing it and we've got all these different things that we could say, we're trying to figure out, well, what do I put into this 7-minute time slot or this 10-minute or however long you have? You can think about, well, what does everything kind of support? Or you can use a kind of reverse process of elimination and think, okay, well, what could I not cut out and still have a message? In other words, okay, if I don't have enough time, I guess I could take this whole chunk out. Or maybe I could take this.
When you said a 7-minute speech, I thought you're going to be taking stuff out at that point. You're not going to be, and sometimes it's just having your expectations. 5-minute TED Talk is very different from a 3-hour workshop, and you have to adjust your expectations for that.
That's right. And, just like you could write a biography that is 300 pages, or you could write a 20-page biography, or you could write a 1-page about the same characters, the same person, and what's going to determine what you do? Audience, purpose, and context, and how much time you have, I guess. But same thing, if you're talking about your work, you could probably talk for an hour, you could probably talk for 20 minutes, you could talk for 3 or 7. So for that occasion, for that situation, how long, I mean, maybe it doesn't have to be super precise, but how much to include and what to leave out, and what your central takeaway is, the one thing you want people to come away with, that will be like an anchor for everything else you include. It's kind of like your North Pole, or number of metaphors might come to mind, but that will figuring out what this is for you and writing it out, so it's basically an assertion, even if you're just doing kind of an instructional talk. Then you can look and say, well, I guess I could leave that out if I have to.
Yeah.
I guess I could leave that out. Ooh, but if I leave that out, that's kind of a clue that maybe that's your part of your bottom line or the heart of your talk. And then making sure that's in there. Then it will be much easier to decide other things to include. Now, you may have to brainstorm and come up with lots of notes and outlines to get at the bottom line. You may not know that from the start. It's not a linear, just like writing a document is not usually a really linear process. It's very circular and iterative. Planning a talk is likely going to be the same way. Even as you practice what you thought was your complete talk, you may be discovering, oh, actually, I need to say this other thing, and I don't really need to say this. And that's all part of the process. And setting your own preparation expectations will be helpful that way.
And not leaving it till the night before. I'm just saying.
Yes, I'm so guilty of that. And I'll often get my preparation done at the last minute, like my document, my written preparation, and then I won't leave myself enough time to practice or run through it. And then that increases my anxiety also. So here are some thoughts. These are not all what you should do or shouldn't do, just to reflect on your own process. Do you write out your text? And I'll talk a little bit about some of the pros and cons of these approaches. Or do you talk from notes? Maybe they're on an iPad or a sheet of paper. Maybe you like to use note cards. That's a good way. I learned that in school, or the equivalent. Do you put everything you want to say on the slides, and if it's not on a slide, you're not going to say it? Actually, don't recommend that approach. Starting with an introduction, to state your primary focus directly. If we were in a longer workshop format, we would discuss all of these things, but I will comment a little bit on some of these. Writing out your text completely has the advantage of security, because then everything you want to say is right there in front of you, and no matter how nervous you get, you can say it. If you're giving a talk with people in the room, and like right now we're just us here putting the webinar on here, you can't make eye contact as well if you're reading from the text. And it's a little harder to adopt a natural style when you write out in advance. You can do it. You can write the way you speak or modify it later, but people tend to slip into a little more of an academic style, which isn't as great to listen to. I go to literary conferences once in a while. People give papers and they basically read a written paper, and you can follow it if it's well done, but the ones where people actually are presenting in a way that's intended for that setting are more engaging. The disadvantage also of writing everything out is it takes a lot of time to do that, and you still need to practice. Talking from notes, you take the risk that you might forget something that you really wanted to say, but it does free you up to make more eye contact But you need to practice more, especially the transitions between sections.
Unless you drop all of your notes and they go out of order because you didn't number them. Ask me how I know.
Yes, and that's another risk. So but it also doesn't take the amount of time that writing out the entire talk will take. So again, there are pros and cons. I mentioned not putting everything you want to say on the slides, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about different approaches to using slides in a little bit. Starting with an introduction, I do think that's helpful. What I would avoid is a really long, drawn-out introduction that keeps readers or listeners wondering where you're even going. But having a little something to help them realize why this matters to them, why they should listen, and tells them what to expect is helpful. Stating your primary focus directly, yes, I do strongly recommend that. That's basically this bottom line up front, as early as you sort of comfortably can. Today, I'm here to urge you to, or ask you to, or discuss, that kind of thing. And I hope that by the time you leave, you will, those kinds of things are fine. They work well. You don't have to come up with the most creative way in the world to be indirect. So covering your most important points first or last, there are a few different philosophies of this, and you might have learned different things in school. I think I may have this on another slide, but I usually recommend covering, if in a list of, say, 3 points that you want to make, or if you have 4, after your introduction. Generally, with a talk, I would go in order of importance, at least because you never know if your time's going to get shrunk.
Or if the fire alarm is going to go off, which happened to me.
Yes, yeah, those kinds of things. Or if some people will zone out halfway through, and so you want to get them more on board sooner. Some of us have a tendency to want to build to increasing levels of interest and importance, like a movie with several action scenes. The best battle will be at the end, or a romantic movie with different levels of romantic interaction. It sort of builds, right? That's not the best way for an informational or a persuasive talk, usually. So I would recommend that. Save the most important information to the end. That's kind of the flip of what I was saying. I would resist the temptation to do that. You might have a great, brilliant concluding thought, great, but in terms of just pure sort of information, I would think through what is the best way. And I'll talk more about organizing here. So a few principles. This is very simple and generic, but bottom line up front, again, as I said earlier, I recommend saying that one principal focus at the heart of your talk as early as you can, just as hopefully with a good email or even a policy or a set of instructions. And this also applies to the subsections that would be equivalent to paragraphs, and really this comes down to the difference between reasoning inductively versus deductively. Inductively, reasoning meaning both when you talk and when you experience and take information in. Inductive reasoning is going from detail to what it all means, broad conclusion. Deductive is when you take a broad principle and then you deduce from it, or you go from general to specific. We experience things and we figure things out inductively. We sometimes want to give our listeners that same experience and hold what it all comes down to the end. But for listeners with new information, and readers as well, who don't really know where you're going, it's more helpful to know first generally where you're going and then fill in the details. Just the principle of having a topic sentence in a paragraph and then backing it up with evidence rather than saving your topic sentence to the end.
So the difference between Sherlock Holmes and Columbo.
Okay, yeah.
In the story.
Yeah.
Columbo, right. Bottom line up front, here's how it happened. And Sherlock Holmes, point, or deduction, conclusion.
Right. And we do both of these all the time, but in terms of how you communicate to your outsider audience, maybe they're inside of your office, but they don't know what you know yet. And then after your bottom line up front is a good place for a short background section or a problem, like here's why I'm talking about this in the first place. It's good to orient them, but don't, I would say, resist the temptation to put that before the bottom line up front. Because you can go on and they don't yet know what you're getting at. It's easier to hear that first and then hear the background. And then also, this is a good place, and this might all be in your intro. This may all take 30 seconds to say, but a little summary of what you're going to do. You're basically, I'd like to talk about 3 reasons for this, or I want to talk about how things were before such and such, and then how they are after, and then how they're going to be after this proposal is passed. And that you're creating an expectation of structure that then your details will have a place to go in your audiences, your listeners' brains. Then you have your primary discussion, or what you might call your main argument, depending on how, what your purpose is. And then some kind of wrap up and any recommendations. What do I want you to do with what you've heard? It's especially helpful in a talk versus even more so than in writing. It's especially helpful to summarize, because they can't go back and reread, unless you're giving them everything in a talk or some slides, but they can't go back and reread the bit that they just missed. And you don't really want them to be constantly going back and looking down, even if you are giving out notes. So it's helpful to reinforce with some repetition. And then there will be a part of your bottom line up front, the sort of practical outworking of your guidance, even if it's just, if you're briefing the boss and your recommendation is, so I'll get back to you on Friday. I mean, that's maybe all your boss needs to take away, really. But in light of all these things, here's what I recommend, or here's what you can do, or here's what you don't have to do. Kind of wrap up the takeaway for them, which will be very similar to your bottom line up front, but maybe with some more practical elements. A few organizational patterns, or I think of them as strategies, for the main points, what I had numbered as number 3 there. And these are just some suggested approaches. When you're sitting with all your material, you've got notes and papers and ideas in your head. Sometimes we say, okay, I'll have 3 main points. The old 5-paragraph essay. That's can be helpful. If you have that, as I said earlier, I recommend you putting your most important or your most persuasive point first. If you have 3 things to say, the odds are they're not all 33% of the weight. Probably one of them is half the weight. So if you say that one first, then you get people halfway on board right away.
I find it helpful sometimes while I'm drafting to play with the highlighters, and the really important stuff gets green, and then maybe the lesser stuff yellow, and then the red is, I could probably delete that. And that's like a consistent color metaphor that at least I can keep straight.
That's a good tip. Yeah, something like that, a system, right, as you're going through notes, whether, on handwritten or on your screen. There's a lot of tools that can help you sift through what can otherwise you can get kind of locked up trying to sort through it all. But, a list of 3 or 4 or 5 sort of parallel points is really only one structural approach. There are a lot of ways to organize your information, and you might consider a few of these. I'm saying argument based on, but it could just be information. It doesn't have to be like a debatable argument. But definition, maybe everything hinges on, well, if we define this way, then in light of that, you might think about, and these are not all mutually exclusive either, or you might think about argument based on history. It doesn't have to mean ancient history. It can mean what has gone before. In the 80s there was this, or, a lot of times Catherine mentioned that I do some work at Homeland Security. At Homeland Security, a lot of times things will start with, after the events of 9/11, right? Or, then the department started, and there's a fairly recent history that everything at DHS stems from. But it can be based on, precedent or what has happened in the past.
Particularly true if you're dealing with policy, as so many of us do one way or another.
That's right. And just taking one of these approaches might help make things more clear and interesting, rather than just thinking, okay, what should I say first, second, or third? You might consider some of these. Similarly, an argument based on authority. That can mean the law says this, therefore, like the Plain Writing Act says this, therefore, I'm talking about plain writing. Or it might be the authority of an expert. When we draw on quotations, we're really doing that, maybe without thinking about it. Or it's just some trusted figure or example that overlaps with history as well. Comparison contrast. You don't have to be trying to make a recommendation between two things to use this. Sometimes to explain one thing, the most useful thing you can do is set it alongside something familiar, just for the purpose of illustration. Like, you're familiar with this, well, this new idea is like it, but it's different. It's like, you could do that.
Excuse me, I have found that to be true. Sometimes when I'm explaining about editing or, revising for plain language, I sort of just say, well, it's like Marie Kondoing your words. Do they spark joy?
Good. Yeah.
So anything that gets the message across.
Right. It's a good, and so that can be an approach where you might use that as a technique for clarity, basically, and to your listeners. And as it says at the bottom of the slide there, as with the idea of a bottom line up front overall structure with your paragraph equivalents, your subpoints, I recommend it like a deductive, or you might call it a reverse climactic, where you're giving away the climax first and then you're giving the supporting bits.
I will never be able to do that without thinking of Peter Falk now.
Oh, interesting.
Columbo,
yeah, good. And then here, if you're doing a comparison contrast, you might remember this from school. And this applies to writing as well. You can set up a comparison one way where you talk about all of one thing. For example, if I wanted to compare the Coast Guard with the Navy, I was in the Navy, and if I wanted to explain the Coast Guard to, say, a group of people more familiar with the Navy, I might say, well, let me understand the Coast Guard if I compare it with the Navy. Well, and I might start by talking all about the Navy, uniforms and mission and ships, and then I would say, now the Coast Guard is like this, and then I could draw the relevant conclusions. Or I could compare the two things along features. I could say, well, let's talk about this feature, Coast Guard, Navy. Let's talk about this feature, Coast Guard, Navy. So either one of these can work well. It kind of depends on the nature of the information and what you're comfortable with.
And I was thinking visually, you could have a table and then use that on your slide to discuss further.
True, that's a good idea. Yeah, you could do that. Or columns, that can be helpful, a little table, things like that. So again, these are just some suggested structural patterns as an alternative to having like 4 points, which is fine as well, but it's not the only way. You can kind of take charge of the organization so that, again, back to the idea of plain language, what's going to be most clear and helpful for your audience. And as with writing, the way something is organized is a huge part of how plain or how clear it is. It's not just about the sentences themselves. Right. Okay, speaking of sentences, just a little bit on style. You have some decisions to make. Do you want to adopt a formal or a more informal style, a speaking style? Not just this applies to how you dress and whether you put your hand in your pocket or how straight you stand also, but in terms of the sentences themselves, are you going to say phrases like, we need to figure out a way forward, or are you going to say, the department needs to determine a way forward? Those are both fairly clear, but one's a little more formal. And they can be, either one might work. It depends on the setting. If it's your regular group around the table once a week, more informal, of course. If it's a higher up group, probably more formal. It doesn't mean you have to be super stiff and formal with your language. You also want to think about the spectrum of personal versus impersonal. I don't mean sharing personal information. I mean using personal pronouns. You, we, us, versus the department, the division, the policy, the government, customers. Those aren't off limits. The Plain Writing Act encourages the use of you, for instance, when you're writing a web page that's for the public, that they're coming, or customers. That's not considered bad to say that. We have teachers in school who tell us, don't say you, don't say I, but that's because that's a very different context. Academic writing and learning to write is different from actually getting stuff done in the workplace, and sometimes a more personal style will be more engaging. There might be a place for a more impersonal style as well. I'm not saying it's always bad, but you want to think about where do you want to fall on that kind of spectrum of those. Right. And that's a choice you should be making rather than something that you unconsciously default to because you're really nervous or you just didn't think about it.
Yeah, if you're talking to the head of your agency, you don't want to start with, hi guys,
That's right. But it is okay to say, I'd love to talk to you today about, rather than, you know, the
The
office
purpose,
of
yes.
this, you know, you don't have to be artificially informal or formal. You also want to think about using active verbs, just as with writing. And again, it's easy to slip into the passive voice and wordy constructions in a speech, just as it is in writing. And, you know, in your notes, and you might even, some key sentences, you might want to write those out, even if you're not writing out the whole thing. You want to think about, and again, the preparation will help with this. If you wing it, you'll default to whatever's sort of slips out of your tongue, off your tongue the most readily, and that'll depend on how much you've practiced. And in some cases, that might be really natural sounding, but to be concise and also precise with your words. Sometimes those are in tension because technical language is very precise, but not if people don't know what the words mean.
Exactly.
Sometimes you need more words to be more clear.
Mm-hmm.
So concise, being shorter is not always better. By concise, I mean not a bunch of unnecessary words. So watch out for that. And then, as I've alluded to, you want to make the decision how much everyday language versus specialized in-house language. How much do I need to define some terms, or just replace those with common, you know, and that's going to vary with the context and all these things. But these are some decisions to make in your preparation.
Like, for example, and this is a minor detail, I just had a meeting before this one where I was talking about our link checking software. And I just called it link checking software, you know, software that checks for broken links on our web pages. I did not see any reason to call it Site Improve. I mean, does that make any difference? They just want to know that somehow their links are being checked.
Okay, sure, yeah, that's much more descriptive and clear. Yeah, that's a great example. So you want to think through advantages and disadvantages of visual aids. Generally, people respond to images. We're very visual-centric culture. So if you have the time and the setting where you can use some visual aids, and by that I largely mean slides, but I will say slides are certainly the default in the marketplace or the business setting, but you know, having an object to pass around can really add a lot to a talk sometimes.
Box of donuts. Just
yeah, there you go. Yeah, or a handout that has maybe a complicated chart that people need time to look at, or a paragraph that you really want them to study rather than putting that up on the slide and then like sitting there awkwardly while they read it or while you read it. Don't recommend that. So think through the pros and cons of different visual aids. I will talk a little bit about slides here, however, since it's so common. So there are really three approaches, I think, to using PowerPoint, or Prezi if you use that, but PowerPoint's the standard, or, you know, most common. One is PowerPoint is the primary content, and by that I mean people put everything on the slides, all the information, so because they're almost treating PowerPoint as a Word document, you know, where you could almost really don't need to talk. And largely people do that when they know they're going to be sending these out and they want people to review them. But this is not a great way to, it's not a good tool for supplementing a talk that you're giving. We've probably all seen presentations where you thought, oh, I could have just read these at my desk. You know, either there's just so much on there to read and it's hard to read it. And so I don't recommend that unless you make a separate set of slides. You can make two decks, one that's going to be sent out that is pretty much self-contained, and the other one that's basically a scaled back version of that, that's a tool for your talk. Now, I know that if you're super nervous about the talk, it's easy to want just everything on the slides, and you want PowerPoint to kind of do the work for you. I know that is how a lot of people feel, but it really doesn't help serve your listeners. So the second approach would be PowerPoint as a structural guide. That's probably how I would describe this presentation. You know, it's sort of an outline of what I'm saying, but I'm saying stuff that's not literally on every slide either. And I think this can be helpful. It's kind of a placeholder. As people look up at the screen, they aren't distracted by reading too much, but if they lose, their attention wanders, they check some email, and they look back up, and they still kind of know where you're at. And it takes a little while to prepare this. It's not necessarily going to be self-contained for sending out to people, so you have to think about that but it will put you more in the driver's seat as the presenter. You know, people are more engaged by a person speaking to them and engaging with the eyes and all those things than they are just with something written. A third approach is similar to that, but it's just, it de-emphasizes PowerPoint even more. It might be a 20-minute talk with only 3 slides. One image that you talk about, and it's kind of in the background, and then maybe you blank that out for a second, and then you come back. So it's just kind of a helpful visual here and there, but it's not the guide to the whole thing. Now, certainly with that, you wouldn't probably send that out to people. So that would be a disadvantage, but the advantage is that it keeps the speaker front and center even more. And again, it depends on your situation, your audience, your purpose, and what the expectations are. You know, if somebody says, I want 5 slides, you're gonna have 2 minutes. You know, then you've got to kind of work within that. So slides are a great way to help create the dual illusion that you have a lot of things worth saying and that you speak with great authority. After all, it must be solid information if it's up there in a fancy slide with bright colors. A good technique is to put lots of text on each slide. This will minimize slide clicks. In addition, lots of text can be a really effective way to force people to look up front and concentrate really hard on the screen rather than you, which is what you want if your goal is to put people to sleep or make them wish they weren't there. Another trick along these lines is to simply read aloud entire slides for your audience, just in case any of them cannot read, if you want to avoid the silence, or if any of them aren't sure why you were there. So hopefully you can tell that's tongue-in-cheek. Don't do that. This is what not to do. And I wouldn't put a heading to slides and then one little bullet. So, but we've probably all been in meetings where somebody did basically that. So here are a few slides. When I was preparing my original version of this long ago, I Googled bad PowerPoint slides. I thought somebody's probably collected some, and I found like the 10 worst ever. And I don't know if these were real from like a speech 101 class at college or if somebody just made them up. So they illustrate kind of extremes of some of the big problems. So let me talk to you today about buying a new suit. So I don't know why that middle yellow thing looks so goofy, but you know,
it's certainly a bad PowerPoint slide.
It is horrible, right? The irony here is that the eyes make you look at not at what the suits, but at the eyes, right? So this illustrates the principle that just because you know how to make something do something on PowerPoint doesn't mean it's a good idea, right? So
and also I should add, that government restrictions on the IT will often prevent you from doing it. So you'll have like check marks,
right,
little X's.
Right. So this is an extreme, and it doesn't really do. You know, the word "wow" doesn't make you more impressed.
It.
Yes. Yeah. Right. This would be a better. I mean, given it within the same deal. You know, if this were my title slide for how to go shop for a suit, something like this would be better, right? So here's another one, not quite so crazy, and the original version of this actually had yellow letters, but I didn't want to take that extra step. Yeah. So you don't have to be a graphic designer to realize maybe this sort of orange background isn't great, you know. But there's more problem with this also. The first bullet is conceptually not parallel with the other bullets, right? The first bullet doesn't belong there as bullet number 1. That should be like a header, or maybe that should be up in the title. I'm imagining that somebody made this slide, you know, talk about different kinds of motorcycles, right? Because they know about motorcycles, and here's beginner ones. So my personal favorite, you probably don't need that in a bullet. Suzuki Savage, that should be on the slide, probably up in the title or something. And then we've also got these 3 features. Lightweight, that's an adjective and a noun, and then a number. Adequate power, adjective and a noun, and then a little number. And then low seat height fits most riders. The grammatical parallel problem, we shouldn't have 2 of these are one kind of thing and one is a sentence. I've seen lots of slides that do this. Actually, it's a little known grammar rule that anything in a list, whether it's a normal sentence or a set of bullets, they should be all the same kind of thing. All adjectives or all nouns or all sentences. Doesn't really matter, but they should be the same type of structure. And so that's another less prominent but subtle, you know, kind of an important issue in this slide. So might do something like this. Now, personal preference, I switched the picture over to the other side. That's not a rule. I kind of like it better that way. And then you can see what I did with the bullets there. Now you can still say, my personal favorite is, it doesn't have to be on the bullet. That doesn't really help. And you could put the weight and the power. Maybe you want them to see those numbers. If you're speaking to a group of people who don't know enough about motorcycles to know about beginner ones,
Right.
those numbers probably aren't going to be as meaningful. If they already know a lot about motorcycles, then you're probably not telling them this stuff.
Right.
That's what gets into thinking about audience and your purpose, and what information do they really need. But it wouldn't be horrible to include the numbers, but then give the low seat height also, give all 3 numbers. But it gets the slide a little more cluttery. Okay, here's another one. This one has some animation to it. So I'm just going to, I suppose the person would be talking as they clicked each of these. And then we'll just, I think oh, there we go. So there we go. So this one, actually, hold on. Oh, you know what? I had this was the good version, except with the bouncing. The animation might be a little distracting.
I thought it was actually really cool, and I don't like animated things, but first I thought, what is this? And I was like, oh, it's emulating racquetball. Right.
So I think that actually does kind of work. There, a version of this one that I didn't keep in here didn't have these as well organized. It had a list of just all equal bullets, and then some of them spun around and some of them sparkled with colors, all kinds of like irrelevant animation. So what I did was I just tightened it up and kept the bouncing animation. So, and for something lighthearted, like, I mean, it's not funny, but lighthearted, like, let me tell you about racquetball. I think it does kind of work as well. But, you know, generally, I think just having things appear works, you know, again, it's part of the tone that you want to set. Okay, one more. I will not actually read this whole thing out loud to you, but this is a lot of times people would, or slightly less bad would be to let people read it themselves. And if I were in the room, I probably couldn't read that if I didn't have my glasses on. So if you really wanted people to read this whole thing, then I would give it out as a piece of paper. The odds are this is not so brilliantly written that they've got to see every word. Okay, so, but you might be starting with this. This might be in your source documents. You're preparing it, right? And it's not poorly written in and of itself, although the 4th bullet is, I just added on as a bonus. But so what you would do is take this and do a little editing, prepare both what you want to say out loud, which maybe would be this in your notes, and then prepare, okay, now based on that, what do I want the slide to say? So here, I think I've got this in 2 steps. This is a little midway editing, lining some stuff out, sort of organizing, well, what have I got here? I've got this, this, and this. You know, and this may not be your material. You might be borrowing this from somewhere else. And then you might come, here's what I would probably put up on the slide. You know, and I know I didn't give you enough time to read that, to think through whether that's great. But
that would allow you to talk about those points.
Exactly. Right. And then these just become little placeholders, the main categories, so that people can kind of attach what you're saying out loud to something. And this was some report based on a real report, I guess. So those are a few tips, a few summary ideas about PowerPoint, and then I'll share just a few things on delivery before we wrap up. So some do's and don'ts, again, in summary, keep your slides relatively simple in appearance. The more stuff that's on there, the more your reader's attention is divided, just like with a website or anything. You may have a lot of things to share. Generally, I would spread it out across more slides, you know, and if you really want people to see everything at once, you can do a little summary slide after they've seen it all. Then suddenly it's familiar and it doesn't seem so cluttered. I'm keeping it clear and focused. You know, generally the presentation should be yours, not PowerPoint. So you should be in the driver's seat. You're using slides as a supplement, as a help to engage the audience. They should be showing, if you have images, they shouldn't be doing that. You're still saying something and then you're showing them, here's what I mean. See, look at this graph, right? They shouldn't have to be standalone. Some don'ts, the flip side of most of the do's, don't put too much information. Again, you're the one driving it. You're the one speaking. not PowerPoint and then I'm going to say a little bit. But then I also don't read everything right off of the slides. Don't be distracting with animations or colors. Basically, the visual stuff that you can add shouldn't draw attention to itself. It should just help make what's on there that easier to look at. And you don't need a slide for every single thing. That's one advantage to having a little bit more sparse slides or just outline level. It gives you a lot more flexibility. And if you think of a new thing, you're not like, oh, I don't have a slide for that, I can't say it. That's the tail wagging the dog. And then, don't present your slides without lots of proofreading. Don't do this. Find misspellings before you begin. That certainly jumps out at you, even if it wasn't in red. And then this was something I found on Google, worst CEO PowerPoint slide ever. I won't attempt to explain it, but it's kind of funny. Sadly, we've probably all seen similar things before. Okay, and then just a couple thoughts on delivery. Looks like we're on time for this. I won't dwell on these too much. These are probably familiar concepts, but as you're taking your notes or your whole written out talk and you've got some slides or not, and you're getting ready, you're in practicing and thinking about presenting, if you do some of these things and you work on these, it'll actually build your confidence a lot too, because you'll work through some difficult spots. But it does take some time and some preparation, and I know I've been guilty of not carving out the time for things myself. So my sort of rubric, there are a lot of ways to think about what makes a well-delivered message, but I divide it into 5 categories. One is your voice, how you use your voice, and that includes projection, sort of volume or getting your voice to reach that person in the back of the room. And you can be a sort of a quiet person, but you can still learn to project. You don't have to change your personality to give an engaging talk. Also, your inflection, how your voice rises. If you use a pretty monotone voice, it's a lot less engaging to listen to. You may not be aware of it, but I was just doing that. I hope you can tell. There's a natural rise and fall to our voices that most of us do pretty well in conversation, right? I mean, we don't. Sometimes some people are a little stronger at that than others, just like we all have different strengths and weaknesses. But practice using maybe more deliberate inflection, because you want to bring all your resources to bear to help your listeners engage with this valuable information. And then enunciation, right? If you don't pronounce the ends of your words, the syllables at the beginnings and the ends, sometimes that's a byproduct of speaking too quickly or not doing that. But sometimes it's just a manner of speech. Some people, the way they grew up or the way they hear things, they don't realize that they don't. And so you may need to deliberately work on that and practice. So these 3 things I would say, if you can work on these, your speech, your voice will be easier to listen to. I don't think speaking with an accent is a problem, whether you're from a different part of the country than your audience or a different country and English isn't your first language. I find speeches by people with accents really engaging to listen to if I can catch the words. Even if the words aren't always grammatically correct for English, I think it's still really engaging. So I don't think that's nearly as much of a problem as these things if you can work on some of these. The second category is tone and style. And now here I mean more your delivery tone, given the set of words that you've decided to use. I did talk about these with wording earlier: formal and informal, personal and impersonal. How do you carry yourself? There's also a kind of intense or relaxed that has to do with a lot of other factors: how loud, how quickly you talk. I'll talk about pacing in a minute, but you can be more or less intense or relaxed, and that should be ideally that'll be a conscious decision, not just a byproduct of how little you care or how worried you are, or whatever. And you can use that as a tool. You can get more intense at certain moments and then relax a little bit, and people will kind of emotionally move with you, and it can be really, really valuable. Timing and pacing, okay, or your pace, the speed at which you speak. Most people speed up when they get nervous. Some people talk quickly anyway. I tend to talk fairly quickly, and I have to consciously, slow down. And my kids, when they give speeches for school, sometimes they'll practice. I'm usually telling them to slow down. And I think if you slow down to the point where it just feels a little bit weird, then you're probably hitting it just about right. As listeners, I've almost never listened to a talk that I thought was way too slow. Maybe once in a great while, but I've heard a lot of talks that I thought were a little too fast. I just couldn't quite catch and mentally dwell on every word as much as I wanted. And so speed is one. Another one is rhythms, and this has to do with the structures of your sentences and the pauses in between sentences. If you speak really quickly, you have less room to vary the rhythm. If you speak a little more slowly, then you have room to add some pauses, speed up in a sentence or two, and then slow back down. You have a little more variety you can actually use speed as a tool rather than it's just like all one speed. And pauses, I guess, are part of that. You can also plan some deliberate, lengthy pauses for emphasis. You can stop and choose, one reason we really need to do, and we tend to be kind of afraid of silence. And that's why we often say ahs and ums. Subconsciously, we just have to fill that empty space. But taking, this is all in the planning and then practicing. But you can actually add a lot of emphasis, and you can capture readers' attentions. That little extra second of silence, people suddenly notice, and they're listening, and then they'll hear the next thing really clearly. And if you did it exactly the same way every other sentence, then people would get tired of it, and it would be meaningless. But it's a tool. Now, your physical presence, your body, basically. Part of that is your stance. You may be sitting, you may be standing behind a lectern, you may be standing without a lectern. Those are elements of context that may not be in your control, but you want to decide, do I want to stand sort of casually with my hand in my pocket? That might put people at ease. Mm-hmm. Or do you want to stand up very straight behind the lectern? And that's a formal, and it's a good sort of in control of the room posture. The one I don't recommend is hunkering down behind the screen to the left of the PowerPoint so that nobody can see you. I know it feels the safest, but it's probably going to engage the audience the least. So just think about that, how you want to use your posture. If you're extremely nervous, sometimes people just hold tight to the lectern. That's better than probably fiddling with your hands all the time. But physical movement in a room is also useful. A deliberate 3 steps over here when you say the second reason that physical transition helps connect the conceptual transition. Now don't just pace back and forth at the same rate all the time, because then that gets distracting. Any of these things can become tics and distractions. And then hand gestures, right? Some people use them a lot and need to tone it down. Other people are afraid to use them. But if some well-placed ones, I tend to use my hands a lot, and I have to make sure I'm not just like flailing them around meaninglessly. But you want to think about that. And then finally, and this could go under presence, but I think it's important enough to keep it separate content. Number 5 coming up, facial expression is a key one, like smiling, or at least not looking angry too much if you can smile. And then close in contact with that, but I'll number it as number 5, as eye contact. And the way I think of it is where you look tells the audience what matters. And hopefully that's them. You're looking at the audience. It can be a little awkward. You don't have to look at one person for 20 seconds, but actually making a second of eye contact with different people around the room. Don't just look over everyone's heads and hope they don't notice. People can actually tell if you're not making eye contact with anybody. So you want to, if you look at your notes, of course your notes matter. The slides, sometimes people turn around and look over their shoulder at the slides all the time, which loses some volume, but it also disengages people. Looking at people's eyes and, using your body and your tone of voice and all these other things really can help to draw people in. And you don't have to be a TED Talk, level person to use these tools. Just a little practice a little effort on some of them, and you can really make quite a difference, and engage people well. And that is, audience member, last one. Yeah, I guess that's all I've got, and right at 3 o'clock. So
fantastic. That was great. You really broke down public speaking for people who may not have done a lot of it, and all of your tips were totally spot on.
Well, thanks.
I really, appreciate the clarity that you bring to the whole thing. Now we have one question. Do you have any quick tips or suggestions to help reduce pre-presentation anxiety?
Yeah, great question. I think the more, if you have the time and you can run through it, the more you can practice, especially the spots that you're the most worried about, right? I mean, there's sort of a general anxiety that a lot of us feel, but there might be some specific things. We can pinpoint those and practice those sentences or those transitions or something that can help. If you go visit the room and kind of think through how you're going to present in that room, that I think that might help a lot. And just getting more familiar with the content. It won't totally banish it, I don't think, but those are a couple that come to mind.
I have a couple of points I'd like to pass on because they're really helpful. Always make sure you eat beforehand. I mean, do not try and do speeches on an empty stomach. Ask me how I know. And another thing, I've been so spoiled by the DigitalGov team that, everything always works. But last year, I was at Confab, the big content strategy conference in Minneapolis with Brain Traffic. And I had been accepted to do one of their lightning talks, which is 5 minutes, 20 slides. They boot you off the stage after your 5 minutes or whatever it is. You get like 20 seconds a slide. Somehow the math works out. And we had a meeting in the conference room that it was going to be held the day before, the night before. And it is really hard to do 20 slides in 5 minutes. I mean, it's harder than you might think. It's harder to do short than long. But I was sitting there watching some other people run out of things to say. And they were like, waiting for the slide to go. And I was like, because it was all automatic slide progression. And I did mine, and I think I squeaked by with just a second or two to spare on one. But that night, I'm positive we all went back to our hotel rooms and flipped open our laptops and like, okay, timer on, boom, 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 watching it, because it was very disconcerting. And I was so grateful for the chance to be able to practice beforehand. So, at least know what the room's like, at least know if the projector's going to work. I mean, things happen and you have to really roll with them.
Right, and having some hard copy backups, at least for yourself, if the slides don't work, that can also add take some of the anxiety out,
Yeah.
Other questions?
Well, there don't seem to be any other questions. I just asked for another one. This may be your lucky day. You may be able to go out for a nice coffee or something on such a nice day, but we'll see if anyone else has something. No, I guess not. But just thanks, Victor, for posting, and thank all of you for attending. Alex, did you want to make any wrap-up sounds or?
No, that was a great presentation. Thank you, everyone. If you're still here, I dropped a link to a survey in the chat. It will be distributed, or may have been already, and be on the lookout for the next Plain meeting. Catherine, anything to say on that?
The next Plain Language meeting, the one in May, is going to be the tour of the lab at OPM. So let me explain that what we have is somebody's coordinating, Kat Catania's coordinating the tour of the lab at OPM tomorrow, fingers crossed. I will be able to update the page on plainlanguage.gov, and I will send it out to the listserv first, and then social media will follow suit just so everybody can sign up for that. I think we have a limit of 35, but you know, very, very important that we do that. What will happen with this program that Chip did for us today? We will, I see that Alex has already typed it. We will post the slides, we will post the transcript, and we'll post the video. Now, this may not be by tomorrow, but it will be, you know, soon, very soon, and I'll, again, alert the list when it's available. I guess that's all.
Great. Thanks, Catherine.
Thank you, everybody.